More nonsense. So yes, welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Ken Peller as the first Consciousness Club speaker of the term. So Ken is currently working as a professor of psychology at Northwestern University in the US, where he is also the director of the cognitive neuroscience program over there. And his research focuses on memory, sleep, and dreaming from both a neuropsychological and a cognitive neuroscience perspective. I personally became aware of his work when I read this really amazing paper about researchers communicating with people while they were lucid dreaming. And I was just blown away by that work. So I am really, really excited to hear what he's going to tell us today during his talk titled Two Sides of Sleep and Memory, Conscious and Unconscious. And take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Nadine. I assume you can hear me okay. Let me know if that changes. And thank you so much for inviting me to your club. Nice to be here, and really, really great to see if we can mix things up. Your focus is often on visual perception, so I thought maybe this complementary side from sleep and from memory might give us some things to talk about. So I look forward to your questions later, or anytime you want to interrupt, that would be fine. So what I'm going to do is first talk about the two sides of memory. So that's really quite basic things. Um, and you're probably familiar with a lot of it, but some work I did when I was living in the UK, I thought I'd get a chance to talk about since I don't talk about it all that much. It was a few years ago. So here's a standard kind of way of thinking about memory, that we encode memories, we store them, and then we retrieve them at some later time. And it's good to think about these metaphors a bit and kind of question them. So, do we really encode and store and retrieve the same thing? If you put $10 in the bank, and you get $10 out, it doesn't have to be the same $10, doesn't matter at all. Is it the same memory we retrieve when we retrieve a memory that we put in? It's really, something quite different. And what is this storage about? I'm going to talk about this idea that maybe this is a general principle, that there's, input and output for all different types of memory, but actually another interesting idea that has pervaded the field for quite a while is that, well, there are different types of memory. So there are different principles depending on what type of memory we're talking about. And I'll get to that a little bit. And then the next thing I want to talk about first, though, is this idea of, well, what happens with storage when you encode a memory and store it? Is that kind of instantaneous? Probably not. It's more of a prolonged process to actually create enduring memories. And so I wanted to look into that because that's something that's really been interesting in my research for a while now. Uh, and so, what is it that allows you to remember? Uh, and form an enduring memory? It's not really just encoding it well or the retrieval strategies, but probably the key is practice. And I'm reminded of this joke. There's this tourist in New York City, and he's wandering around trying to find Carnegie Hall, and he runs into this maestro, and he asks the maestro, "Can you tell me how to get to Carnegie Hall?" And of course, the answer is practice. You have to practice to get there. And we know practice is necessary for skills. Of course, to get good at a skill, you have to practice. But it's really the principle for all types of memory, that if you want to remember a fact, if you want to remember someone's name or an episodic bit of information, practice is kind of critical. And we talk about that as reactivating the memory, which you can do intentionally when you're trying to get better at learning that information. But it can also be unintentional. It can be when you're awake or when you're asleep. It can be when you're conscious of practicing or when you're not conscious of practicing. So I think we kind of think of all those types of practice as relevant to memory storage and this function we call consolidation, of transforming storage, of somehow forming new connections so that the information you've learned is stable and available when you need it. So that's the consolidation function. And just to put a sharper point on that, if you think about what you've been doing today, I guess in London, it's late in the day, so you've had a lot of experiences already today. And if you kind of went through them and thought about, well, what are the things that I've done today? I'm sure you could remember tons of things that have happened to you that you've thought about. And these experiences can be retrieved right now. But if you think about uh, how well you're going to remember all this stuff, in a couple of weeks, maybe not so much. You're not going to remember all the details the way you remember it can remember that day now. So we have all these potential memories. We form many memories each day, but as the days pass, they're pretty difficult to recall. So what will you remember from today? A lot less than right now you could potentially remember today. So that's this, normal scenario that we form some memories, but then they get reactivated, and consolidation is how the information that's come in is transformed so that it's in a enduring form so that you could actually, keep it for a long time and have it at some future time. And this consolidation part has been, critical in how we think about amnesia. We think about that the lack of consolidation gives rise to retrograde amnesia. It gives rise to the problems that patients have not being able to remember. And uh, it's always been a question of, well, how do we measure that? How do we see it happen? When is it happening? And what is it involving? It's involving some interactions between the hippocampus and the cortex, but that's a little bit vague. How do we get that to be a little bit more specific? So let's think about amnesia. That's the other point. There are many types of memory, and this principle has been clear for memory researchers for the last quite a few decades. Um, and came out of amnesia. Like, here's one fun example from 1911. Don't try this at home, but the uh, doctor went to his patient with a pin in his hand and was shaking hands and hurting the patient. So had this experience of shaking the hands with a patient that he knew was amnesic, and he came back the next day and offered his hand to shake, and the patient didn't want to shake. So clearly she had some memory, but she didn't really seem to remember that episode from the day before. She didn't say, you had a pen in your hand last time, but she said, no, I don't feel like shaking right now, or made up some other reason. So a lack of a episodic memory, but some knowledge that this had happened before. And so that's when we've been really thinking now about defining all the different types of memory, that really it's one type of memory in amnesia, the recall and recognition of facts and episodes, that patients have the most problem. That's their serious problem, and they're preserved in so many other ways. At least if you're looking at a patient with circumscribed amnesia, certainly you can't have dementia, but in circumscribed amnesia, there's a very limited problem that spares language, working memory, attention, and also spares recall and recognition of remote facts and episodes, that the patients will remember their early childhood or young adulthood and seem to be quite good at that. So it's a selective impairment of declarative memory for forming new memories and some memories in the past prior to the insult. And then not all types of memory. So this other type of memory we now call non-declarative memory. It's distinct from declarative memory, but it's a bunch of different things: skills, habits, some types of conditioning, and priming, which is the one I want to talk to you about a bit more. And then we'll come back to this model of the two sides of memory, the conscious side and the unconscious side. So let me present this. Actually, let me make an adjustment. You're still hearing me, but I seem to have lost my picture of you, and I have to get Zoom to show me you guys again. Nah, not working for that. Okay. I will assume you're still.
We are still here.
um, I guess I need a third screen to have that. Anyway, let's carry on then. Uh, Here's an example of priming, and this was, a wonderful time I had as a postdoc in Manchester working with Andrew Mays. Uh, it was great to live in the North, had a great time there, and got to do some studies of amnesia with Andrew Mays's collection of amnesic patients. And so this is one of the experiments we published from that time when I was a postdoc. Uh, and it's a type of priming that had been studied by others before. So part of it is a replication. If you look at a list of words, and then later on we give a implicit memory test, it's not presented as a memory test. The instructions are just try to read the word. It's flashed very quickly, and we can adjust the duration of the masks and everything to make it so that you can only see about half the words. And in that test, this group of 9 amnesic patients and the age-matched controls perform quite similarly. They're getting, 50 or 60% correct on the words that they didn't see earlier in the study phase. And for the ones they did see earlier, they're showing this great priming effect. They're able to read those much more accurately. So there seems to be some facilitation, some fluency with the words that they've seen earlier. And you can contrast that with their performance on a recall or recognition test. Of course, they're down on that, and this is a recognition test for the same words that they had seen in the study phase. They're not at floor in these particular amnesics. They're still clearly impaired. They're not able to pick out the one word that they had seen before from the list of three. So this is the example, again, many examples in literature on this, preserved priming with impaired declarative memory, and the priming seems to be pretty normal as far as we can tell. So it's not just an easier memory test that they don't do as bad, but seemingly normal performance on these various sorts of priming tests. This one's sometimes called word identification or perceptual identification. Our experiment actually had another component, though. In addition to trying to read the word, they also had to estimate how long it had flashed. And there were 4 different durations that they got some training on. So they used this 4-point scale to say how long was the word on the screen. And the results from that also showed a priming effect. So there's a priming of duration estimates. And even though the durations for the primed words and the unprimed words didn't differ, they all rated the primed words as having been on the screen longer. So we think about that as an inference made maybe unconsciously from the fluency. The words were a bit easier to read, so the inference was made, well, they must have been on the screen a bit longer, and they gave a higher rating for the primed words than the unprimed words. So they have this knowledge that can drive their priming, but just doesn't drive their recall and recognition very well. So this is the implicit memory, item-specific implicit memory for these words. There was another test I did in my time in Manchester, and this was priming of face matching with Andy Young as well. And this is a test where you get 2 faces on the screen, and you just have to say, is it the same person or 2 different people? So here's one example. This is Andrew Mays. So you would answer, that's the same person. And then what happens is after 10 minutes, then you get a whole set of new pairs mixed with old pairs you've seen before. And the question is, are you faster at processing these faces the second time through? That's what happens in Young subjects. They're faster at responding to prime than the unprimed. And here are the data for the amnesic patients that we ran in the matched controls. And you can see that it doesn't, for all the conditions, it's the same. It's a judgment where the answer is same, or the judgment where the answer is different, or famous people they've known, familiar faces or unfamiliar faces. And in all cases, there's a speed up for prime faces. Now you'll notice the amnesia patients are slower, which is typically found. So exactly the proportion of priming is a little hard to say when the reaction time's not matched. But nevertheless, they're showing this priming effect. We can kind of say that. They seem to be showing priming. So another example in literature of preserved priming, they seem to have this unconscious type of memory working and not the declarative memory, conscious type of memory. So here's the 2 sides then. On one side, declarative or explicit memory, and the other side, all these other types of memory that we call non-declarative memory that seem to come without the knowledge of having retrieved the information. It doesn't come with a conscious retrieval aspect, even though you can engage in the skill. So, I mean, if you engage in a skill and you know you're really better at it than you were previously before the practice, it's because declarative memory is helping you remember that you're better at it. The skill itself, we think the neural mechanisms of the skill don't give you this knowledge of retrieving the information and knowing that you've improved on it. So a lot of work as I was coming up in memory research on isolating these different types of memory and studying them separately. And then we were also thinking, well, they actually don't work separately in a lot of cases in our lives. They work together. We use our skills and our declarative memory together as we're acquiring new skills. And so how do we put all the parts back together to see how they work together? That's led to some interesting questions. And one example of that is if you think about, well, when you're taking this priming test, and if you're not amnesic, you could kind of think, well, let me think about those words and those faces I saw before. Oh, is this a word I saw before? You can kind of use that declarative strategy, and that could influence your priming. So, of course, what we do is we work really hard to try to make the implicit memory test one in which you don't bring in those other strategies to get a more pure measure. So there can be a crossover from the conscious side to the unconscious side. The other direction is kind of interesting, though. When we have a memory experience, when you recognize something, is it just the explicit memory system allowing you to do that, or does the priming kind of prime you to get to the point of being able to recognize something? And another way to phrase that is, well, is there some unconscious retrieval where it starts unconscious and eventually gets conscious? I mean, how could it not be that way? So there's the unconscious processing, and eventually it gets strong enough or acquires some certain properties to then be conscious retrieval of recall or recognition. Uh, and part of my early career spent a lot of time looking at that and looking at neural correlates of that. Uh, and so I just wanted to reflect on that a little bit without going into too much of it. Uh, there's ERP literature of neural signatures of familiarity. And one of the controversies that got me down for a long time was wondering, well, wait a minute, are these signals of conscious familiarity, or are the ERP signals like the FN400 a signal of the precursors of that are unconscious and are maybe identical to the signals of perceptual priming? And so that's part of the controversy about FN400 is it a signal of the conscious memory, or is it a signal of the precursors that are unconscious and analogous to what drives priming? So a related question, or way we got at that in a kind of a different way, was looking at very simple visual perceptual memory. So in this experiment with Joel Voss, when he was a grad student at my lab, he's now at the University of Chicago, he was asking, can we take some very simple stimuli and show whether perceptual priming mechanisms can lead to recognition performance, which we would put on the declarative side. And so we got these kaleidoscopes from Paul Reber, and we could make a bunch of different kaleidoscopes with all the same colors and then use them in a memory test. So they would get to see, I don't know, a dozen of these kaleidoscopes one after another. And then they could get a memory test either with one at a time or many at a time. And so we therefore wanted to contrast two types of study cases, one where you're fully paying attention to these kaleidoscopes, so the green one on top, full attention, and another condition where you have to do a simultaneous working memory task. You have to listen to these numbers like 3, 8, 4, and say on each trial, was the previous number odd or even? So you're making these judgments and keeping the words in mind and the numbers, but your visual system is totally occupied by this test. And so this is the question of, does divided attention influence memory performance? Certainly we have expectations that it would. So the literature would say, poor encoding, divided attention, that's going to mess up both recollection and familiarity on a memory test. And in fact, we see that if we test yes-no recognition. So one kaleidoscope at a time, you have to say, is that one I've seen before or not? And people do way better if they've paid attention fully rather than having to do the dual task, a working memory task. But the interesting result was, okay, if we also test two alternative forced choice, and you get two very similar kaleidoscopes, and you have to say, well, which one did you see before? Then it turned around, and we got this kind of remarkable finding where performance is better after divided attention than after full attention. So a real exception to the rule you would see in explicit memory. And I wrote in, we had two experiments. They're getting 72 or 73% correct for the kaleidoscopes that they saw under divided attention. So they're quite good at picking out which one they've seen before. And then we did another experiment, or one of those two experiments had confidence judgments. And so then the results got interesting. The confidence judgments showed that the reason they're so good after divided attention is because their guesses are very accurate, and they have more guesses after divided attention than after full attention. So they're guessing, and their guesses are remarkably accurate. So we came up with some terminology. We could call this implicit recognition, or the idea is it's implicit memory driven recognition, maybe analogous to intuition in some sense, because their divided attention leads to this more accurate recognition, and it seems to be based on the guesses. There's some more experiments that we followed up with this. It seems like the phenomenon isn't quite as stable as you might like, but nevertheless replicated in quite a few experiments. Another one here where we used the remember no task to measure recognition and saw kind of the same thing, that the improvement for divided attention, it's really on those guess trials where they're making more guesses and they're more accurate for those guesses. That's what's shown on the top figure is how many guesses they make, and then the one over here is how accurate they are in that. I think I'm missing the axis somehow. Um, we also looked at ERPs, and we seem to have an ERP correlate of this, implicit recognition, just like, when you see a word that you've seen recently or face you've seen recently, here it's seeing that kaleidoscope and a different response for the ones that you happened to see earlier that might be related to the implicit memory. That's the idea there. So several arguments, you see these two kaleidoscopes, like these two red ones, and one of them you've seen before, the other one you have not seen before, and you're trying to pick which one, and you think you're guessing because they're so similar, and you don't know which one you saw before. And obviously, if you think you're guessing, you could just always pick the one on the right, or you could alternate right and left. So this only works if you actually guess based on some information that you have that you're not quite aware of, and you make these confident guesses, and we can see the ERP correlates. Another study from Mark Desposito's lab at Berkeley had this same kaleidoscope test, and they used TMS to frontal cortex. So if you disrupt dorsolateral prefrontal cortex with TMS, you get better guesses on this test. So it seems like taking the frontal cortex offline so you're not overthinking it helps you make use of that small information, some in your visual system, some signal of which kaleidoscope you've seen before that you can use to guess which one of the two was the one you've seen before. Our experiments also showed that time pressure is helpful for this. If you give people several seconds to decide, then it's going to take. It seems to not show this accurate guessing phenomenon, so it has to be kind of quick responses. We had one experiment with unilateral stimuli to look at, if it's on the same left side, both at study and test, you get this result, but not if it switches sides, and more ERP results that I'm not going to go into. But so this was an interesting little adventure with Joel Voss and I to sort of say how can we, if we kind of take most meaning out of it and the color names are out of it, you can't recognize one by saying what's the red one because they've all got red. So without some verbal strategies, just a more visual perceptual strategy, there seems a way that you can get the priming mechanism to support recognition and show that there is this crossover from the unconscious side to the conscious side. All right, so just to try to put that together, we have implicit memory on the right, and these are tests where we're not letting people know that they're supposed to use their declarative memory to get the answer, and we can see normal priming in amnesia and in many other cases, but there's some exceptions. So it's not every priming test that gives this result of normal priming in amnesia. So we kind of say there's certain types of priming. Andrew Mays and Danielle Montali have called that cross-domain priming. So if you're connecting across different cortical regions to show the priming effect, that's impaired in amnesia. It doesn't fit on the side, even though it's on the unconscious side. So we think that declarative memory depends on this interactions between the cortex, thalamus, and hippocampus to allow this memory to be available for you, and also some types of priming and maybe even some types of trace conditioning. So not everything, there's not a total one-to-one mapping on what's impaired amnesia and what your conscious memory is getting you. So it kind of leads to the question, well, what's special about declarative memory? Because these priming effects, they depend on the cortex too. So the very same cortical regions that are processing faces must be giving rise to the face priming, or same with words for the word priming. But what's happening to lead to priming must be different. It must be just like single cortical modules, whereas remembering an episode or a fact, it's linking them together. So I sort of in jest have this called the cortical constellation theory, that the reason you're conscious of these declarative memories is because it's a whole set of cortical regions working together that gives you that consciousness. And this is not a theory in a sense. It's just something in common. Like I noticed Adam Zeman in his book on consciousness kind of said that, well, that seems to be something in common with a lot of theories of consciousness, that they say, well, it's not just one part of the cortex, but some number of parts of the cortex. Lame might say recurrent processing between just two regions is enough. Maybe in this picture, it's sort of like, well, some certain sets of cortical areas seem to be what's happening when we have a conscious experience, as in declarative memory retrieval, compared to these other examples of implicit memory. Okay, one couple more things before I get to the sleep part of the talk. Just to think about these different types of memory, I think it's fun to kind of say, well, okay, we have declarative memories and we have implicit memories, and when you're remembering something from your childhood, maybe you don't have very strong declarative memories. You can't remember all these things from your first 5 years, for example, but we've acquired lots of knowledge during that time. We can think of those as implicit memories. And, in psychoanalysis, the story used to be, well, let's get those weak unconscious memories and make them conscious, or try to recover some lost memories. But in this way of thinking about declarative memory, that's not quite the right strategy, because those declarative memories might not be there anymore. I mean, the whole idea of infantile amnesia is that perhaps those episodic memories you acquire in your early years are embedded in your semantic structures. They have to be. They're connected to how do you think about your relationship to other people, who you are, and what the world's like. And in your first 5 years, you have a drastically different understanding of the world compared to later childhood and adulthood. And so those old memories, I would present anymore. They were embedded in the structures of your understanding of the world, your semantic knowledge, which have been drastically overwritten as you become more and more understanding your place in the world and thinking about everything. So that's why we don't have access to these memories, but we still have the scars, or the implicit memory. We may keep the scars and have that implicit memory gained through the years. So looking at my time, I think I should switch to the sleep part, but we'll bring them together. And as it turns out, the sleep part is totally about memory too. So the reason I got interested in sleep, well, sleep is fascinating for a lot of reasons, but I started doing research because I was thinking about, well, how is this consolidation process working? And is sleep going to be part of our understanding of how consolidation works? So in my first paper, also with Joel Voss in 2004, we put this figure together that okay, during sleep, maybe some memory fragments are reactivated, not maybe a whole episodic memory, but little pieces of the things that you learned that day could be reactivated. And then those interactions could lead to altered storage and maybe selective improvement in certain memories. And so this is sort of an idea that's continued to get elaborated on. And in 2004, maybe we were thinking, oh, that's probably connected to dreams and REM sleep. Uh, and then there was some transition where the focus got to be more about, oh, deep sleep, and that's when memory consolidation is happening in slow wave sleep. So that's more of the newer ideas, and I've written about that in a paper with Andrew Budson that we published earlier this year, and it's connected to an actual theory of consciousness, which is from Andrew and his colleague, called the memory theory of consciousness. And I'm not going to go through that theory. It's really Andrew's theory to explain. But I'll give you a little thumbnail sketch of it. And basically, the idea is that, well, we have this declarative memory system. It allows us to encode an episode or a fact and store it and then retrieve it later. So it's working memory and episodic memory kind of together. And this is the system that we've been studying in memory research. And Andrew's thought about it is that could be the very same system that gives us conscious experiences of any sort in perception, in memory, in sleep. It's maybe that same system that's the one responsible for it. And so that's a very provocative idea to say, well, it's not that memory is, it's not that first you have your cortex and you become conscious of something and then you can of course remember it, but it's saying, well, no, that's one and the same thing going on according to Andrew's theory. So I'll leave that for a later topic, given that I'm not the expert on Andrew's theory, but I refer you to that 2002 paper if you're interested in that. So a question then for this memory processing that I wanted to entertain now is, this memory processing during sleep, is that necessarily unconscious? Are parts of it conscious? How should we be thinking about the conscious and unconscious side of this memory processing during sleep? And so the two sides of that are interesting because we don't remember that much about what happens during sleep. And if you take on board the idea that you're dreaming every night a lot, but remembering just a little bit of those dreams, maybe one dream, maybe no dreams. Probably plenty of you remember no dreams uh, on certain nights. But if we were to wake you up in a sleep lab repeatedly in any stage, we would often get dream reports. So you're having lots of dreams, you're not remembering them when you wake up. So that's sleep amnesia. The fact is, we have incomplete knowledge of what we experience during sleep. So you're having these conscious experiences, dreams, and not necessarily remembering them later. Uh, so certainly they're conscious experiences. They're perhaps due to some coherent cortical constellations uh, as you're processing that information and having that experience of a dream. But it could just be um, not remembered later. That doesn't mean you weren't conscious of it at the time. Uh, so then here's a speculation. Now, maybe all this memory processing you're having during sleep is really mostly unconscious, and there's just a little piece of conscious experience that we call dreams. But the important stuff, the important processing for consolidation, maybe that's all unconscious processing. And I want to think about that. And then part of that question is, well, how do we even know there's memory processing during sleep? And so one of the methods that I've been using for that to try to address that is called targeted memory reactivation. Because, if you just compare how well do people remember after sleeping, 8 hours of sleeping versus 8 hours of being awake, you might get the answer that, oh, memory's better after 8 hours of sleep. But what does that really mean? Because during wake, it's not just the absence of sleep, it's all this interfering information that's happening as you do things while you're awake. So it's not a very good comparison to really nail down the role of sleep in memory processing. It's confounded by time of day often, or if not that, interfering information. So this TMR method gets us stronger information to say something's really happening in sleep to change uh, memory storage. And so our experiment in the first example in 2009 was with learning locations of objects. And so there were 50 different objects people had to learn. Each one was coming together with a sound. So you saw the cat, you heard a meow. Every object had its associated sound, and every object was in a random place. And people, through repeated trials, learned precisely where each object was located on the screen. And after that learning, they, in my lab, had a nap. And we recorded their EEG, verified that they were sleeping, and when they were in slow wave sleep, we presented half of the sounds that they had heard in the task. So we intended to reactivate half of those spatial memories and not the other half. And we kind of picked them so that they'd be matched on these two sets, the cued ones and the uncued ones. And then they had their memory tested when they woke up. And the results on the right show that there was forgetting generally. If we didn't reactivate the memory with our sound, then there'd be 15 or more percent less accurate. You'd position the object farther away from the correct location, and not much forgetting for the ones we reactivated during sleep. So our inference is those sounds didn't get blocked, as some prior theories might have suggested. Those sounds actually got in. They were very soft, but they were processed sufficiently so that the sound reactivated the visual image of the object and its spatial location so that you rehearsed that information, you activated the spatial location of the cat and the other 24 objects, and were then less likely to forget those locations when we tested you. So this shows pretty strongly that memory activation during sleep can change memory storage. And then the other half of that reasoning, of course, is, well, does this memory activation happen during sleep even if you're not presenting sounds? And there's good evidence for that now that we're learning more about the physiology of it and what are the signals during sleep, the slow waves and spindles and ripples, for example, that we can measure that seem to be associated with that reactivation of memory. And as Nadine mentioned, we've used a variant of this method with dreamers. So I'll tell you about that in a moment. First, I want to give you a little bit more information about this TMR method for memory. So not just our one study in 2009, but lots of other studies have been done. And there's even a multi-lab replication study coming out of Germany in process to try to replicate and substantiate this result. But we always have a lot of evidence that say this result can be repeatedly found, although there's some boundary conditions that are quite important. Here's one of the follow-up studies. And Eitan Shechtman, when he was a postdoc in my lab, did this study where instead of just a mapping of each sound has one object, some sounds had two objects that they were associated with you, and some sounds had six objects. And the question he asked was, when you present these, does it lead to the same amount of memory benefit, or does maybe for two and for six, the memory reactivation is kind of spread out over more objects, so it might lead to less improvement in memory for each single object, and that was the result was equivalent memory benefits. So it looked like all of these cases, all the objects, even all six of them, would gain from presenting that sound during sleep. So it seems that the one of the interpretations here I'd like to make is that, well, it looks like there's no bottleneck. Uh, it seems like this could be unconscious memory processing, because one of the features of conscious memory processing, of course, is there's a limited capacity. You can only consciously remember so many things at once, whereas unconsciously, no limit on that. You can remember all those things. So maybe all six uh, object locations got reactivated by the one presentation of sound. And we looked at the physiology too. So if you look at the EEG in different frequencies, as shown here, there's an increase. Time zero is when we present the sound. So right after the sound presentation, there's an increase in slow wave activity, followed by an increase in spindle activity, that little dot up here at about 15 hertz, or, it's 12 to 16 or so. So we think this is related to the spindle increase, and these two responses were larger for the sounds associated with six objects than two objects versus one object. So it seems that more memory processing is perhaps happening as indexed by these different signals that we can get. And Eitan has gone on to study this more, and he kind of argues that when you reactivate something during sleep, it brings along the things you learn together with it, like the context. And so the context can be reactivated as by presenting a signal for something. And so that kind of fits with this idea that there's not a bottleneck in memory processing, that there's unconscious processing, and that the activation can spread from one thing to a related item to the context during sleep. And perhaps that's the way we should think about this memory processing during sleep. Of course, I should have mentioned, when we do these TMR studies, people wake up and we can ask them, did you hear any sounds? And they can often say, most of the time, say, no, I didn't hear any sounds. They don't know they're reactivating memories. So the assumption is, well, you're not remembering reactivating memories, but of course, possibly you've forgotten that you did. But this evidence kind of speaks to the question of, well, no, it seems like it's got the characteristics of unconscious processing. Um, and so uh, the, the, the answer I'm tentatively wanting to give is this memory activation during sleep is unconscious. But as I mentioned, there's a qualification here. Like, we could ask, are you actually unconscious during sleep? Uh, Maybe you're not really unconscious, but you're just forgetting because of sleep amnesia. So we could be conscious, but amnesic about what happens during sleep, just like might happen with twilight anesthesia. Uh, and like what's happening with our dreams. The fact we don't remember our dreams, we maybe don't remember processing memories. But this argument here is saying, well, it's conscious because, if memory activation is conscious, there's this bottleneck and limited capacity and probably inhibitory surrounds. So you're reactivating some information and inhibiting adjacent concepts, whereas the opposite is happening during unconscious processing. So I think, well, this is still an open question. We probably need more studies of this, but I think it's a pretty interesting question to say, well, what are the differences between conscious and unconscious reactivation? And we have one very early study of that from last year, where we tried to compare that. We didn't have the sleep condition, but we asked, if we give you reminders of things you've learned consciously versus unconsciously, what are the differences? And does as the kind of key result would be, it looks like there's more spreading to adjacent information when you give unconscious cues to lead to reactivation. And so it's a beginning. I think I don't want to push that too hard. I think we still have a lot to learn about how is memory activation happening both when you're awake and when you're asleep, and how is it different for conscious and unconscious type of memory activation. It's kind of a key question still. Uh, and the conscious part is interesting. So let's finally get to that. Um, we do have conscious experiences during sleep, and we call those dreams. That's pretty much what defines a dream, is your experiences during sleep. Uh, and we can kind of debate, well, which kind of experiences count. It could be an immersive kind of narrative where things are happening to you, or it can be kind of thinking, and maybe the thinking isn't our typical kind of dream, but it's another experience we have during sleep. uh, and a question now, getting back to my memory emphasis, is, well, is that dreaming, is that part of the memory processing? Is it helpful? And that's a bigger question here, is why do we dream anyway? And my view on that is we don't quite have an answer to that question yet. Maybe it's adaptive and helpful, but another possibility is maybe it's really that unconscious processing that's adaptive and helpful, and the that's what we really use every night. We're taking advantage of our downtime to bring up the memories of that we've acquired that day, and see how do they fit with things we already know, and how do you integrate them, which ones are relevant for the things that are bothering you, that keep coming to your mind when you're mind wandering. And this kind of mind wandering memory processing is what leads to some memories getting stronger and being connected to other memories, so that they're uh, getting consolidated more than some other memories, because we're not keeping everything from the day, as I mentioned. So by this view, maybe dreams are just a small subset of the reactivated memories that kind of get assembled due to our habit of forming episodic memories. We spend the day having thoughts and having experiences of events, and our brain goes back to doing that and assembles these stories while we're sleeping too, based on little pieces of the memory fragments that are getting reactivated based on this memory activation and consolidation process. Um, and I know there's sleep researchers, there dream researchers that want to say, no, dreams really are more than that. They're more important to that. And so I'm open to that idea, but I'm still waiting for the evidence, because it's really hard to rule out that the unconscious processing is producing it, and then the conscious processing is extra. I mean, I guess, one example is, if you wake up and have dreams and talk about them with your friends, well, that's going to influence your memory processing too. So that's got to be relevant. So this, the social dimension of dreams certainly is going to influence memory processing, because you're thinking about the dream and talking to people. But the other question is just the fact that you had a dream, is that helpful for memory or for other things? And so while I'm mentioning other things, let's mention one, problem solving. We've studied that in sleep as well, because it's right there adjacent to memory. When you reactivate memories and integrate something, that's an opportunity for making some new connections, for getting some new insights, for being creative. And so with Mark Beeman, we studied problems like this one, where you have to say, uh, make that triangle uh, point down instead of up by moving just three of those black circles. And people can do that. Sometimes they get the answer, sometimes they don't. So Kristen Sanders ran this cool study that's like a TMR study. I mean, it had these kind of a learning part, and then a testing part, and then sleep with TMR, and then a post-sleep test. But in this case, the learning part was getting presented with these puzzles, like with this triangle, and then failing to solve it. So the test is, well, you try to get the answer and you don't get the answer. Here's the answer. Move those three, it goes down. And so Kristen Sanders and Mark Beeman have this set of problems they've been studied to ask, is there some unconscious problem solving happening during sleep? Is there a reason we say, I'm going to sleep on it before I, make that important decision? So here's the design. Let's see if you can see it. You have an evening session where you get exposed to puzzles, and we keep giving you puzzles as long as you keep solving them. But we stop when you've failed to solve 6 of them. So 2 minutes each, you try to solve a puzzle. It can be like matchsticks, where you have to move matchsticks to make an extra triangle or something like that. And each puzzle has a sound that goes with it, as a musical kind of soundtrack that you hear repeatedly while you're working on the puzzle. And then, just like on our other studies, half of the puzzles get reactivated during sleep. So we take 3 of those puzzle soundtracks and play them repeatedly during slow wave sleep, while people sleep in the home with a wireless device on their forehead to measure sleep and determine when they're likely in slow wave sleep. They come back in the morning, try to solve the puzzles. This time they get a little longer. And the question was, how well do they do for the puzzles, as a function of whether it got queued overnight or didn't? And here's the results. They go from about 20% being solved to over 30% being solved if we gave them the cues. So it seems that the cues could reactivate the puzzles. And well, we don't know, did they dream about the answer? But we know, well, they were more likely to get the answer the next morning when they came to the lab and tried to solve the problem. So certainly, uh, our memory processing during sleep is not just for memory, but it's for working out difficulties we have and maybe getting around some barriers to solutions. At least that's the idea in this kind of experiment. Um, we've done another one more recently asking, well, what about the dreaming part? So Karen did a similar study, same kinds of puzzles, and she asked, well, if you dream about the puzzle, are you then more likely to come up with a solution? And she found that we can present cues to people and analyze their dreams, blind to which cue they got, and show that they tend to dream more about the puzzles we reminded them of than the uncued puzzles. And uh, then the second question was, well, if they dream about it, do they more likely get the answer? So for incorporated here means the puzzle had some aspect of the puzzle, after the soundtrack was played, some aspect of the puzzle entered their dream. And in those cases, there was more of uh, you know, not a real strong effect, but some kind of replication of the study we had the result we had from the prior study was slow wave sleep cues. These cues came in REM, and some participants had lucid dreams as well, which made them try to solve the puzzle, although they usually didn't quite get the solution in their dream, but were more likely to solve it the next day when they tried to solve it. So let me transition now to lucid dreaming because that's come up there. What is lucid dreaming? That's when you are in a dream and you know that you're dreaming at the time of the dream. And most of our dreams are non-lucid. At least for most of us, we wake up and if we remember a dream, it's only when we woke up that we realized we were dreaming. During the dream, we thought we were awake and experiencing whatever it was, however crazy it was. So we use our TMR method to try to help people understand that they're dreaming while they're still in the dream. And so we call it targeted lucidity reactivation. The learning before sleep is now to connect a particular sound we play with the concept of thinking carefully about your experience. And you could all do that right now. Think about your experience, what you're perceiving, and what's happening, and ask yourself, am I dreaming right now, or am I probably awake? So you can get into the habit of asking that in a sophisticated way. And people were trained so that when they heard this particular sound, these three beeps, they would engage in that thinking. And so then what we do is we present those same sounds during REM sleep. And so here's a case where we would present the sound at this point, and then they made a signal to us at this point because our instructions were, if you realize you're dreaming, let us know by moving your eyes to the left and to the right twice. So they move their eyes left and right, and this is the left-right signal, left-right signal here. And that's their signal that while they're still in REM sleep, and we can attest to that, their EMG is still low. They seem to not have the features of waking up, so they're still in REM sleep and signaling to us. And this had been done, of course, these signals for many decades, but this is a little different because now we're saying, can we use a sound that trains you to more likely get into a lucid dream? And it often doesn't work, but sometimes we succeed and people can signal back. And so then having this method available to us, we went to another step to ask, can we actually communicate back and forth in a sense of asking questions and getting answers from someone who's dreaming? Because we'd like to know more about the dream at the moment you're dreaming. So dream research has this kind of flaw where most studies have been based on what people say when they wake up. And we really want more than that. We want to look at what's the brain activity during a dream and what are they experiencing at the moment of that dream. And this method, two-way communication, is allowing us this opportunity to now say what's happening at the moment someone's dreaming, what are they experiencing right then. And to make sure it was working, though, we wanted to ask a question where we knew the answer. So we asked them simple math questions. And this was Karen Konkoly's work in her dissertation in my lab. And then a group in Germany that did the same thing, and a group in France and the Netherlands that did the same thing. So these four groups got together to publish this study. And here's one example from our lab. So you can see on the left, during wake, you see muscle activity and and signs of wakefulness. And then in the red box, this is a period of REM sleep, and you see these left, right signals. So this is when the subject is indicating to us, well, I realize I'm dreaming now, and I'm actually still asleep. I'm in the sleep lab, even though I think I'm somewhere else, and I'm moving my eyes left and right to indicate that to you. And at that moment, Karen decided to press a button on the computer to present a problem. And there was a prearranged idea that we're going to present math problems to you, and you're going to answer with a number that's the number of left rights. So they didn't know which math problem they were going to get. This one happened to be 8 minus 6. And so that sound was presented very softly to not wake them up. 8 minus 6 was the question. The answer came out 2. Another problem was given, another answer. This didn't happen every time we asked a problem. A lot of the time we ask the question and we don't get any answer at all. But when we got an answer, it was often correct, more often than not. So this kind of demonstrates that we can communicate with someone while they're asleep, and they're remaining in sleep according to the criteria for REM sleep and dreaming about something. In this case, here's a guy dreaming about being in some building and seeing lights flash and hearing the question and signaling the answer to an experimenter who's able to monitor that. So we can now do this communication and ask some more questions about not just math questions, but what's happening during sleep. And so we have eye movement signals. The group in France used muscle twitches. So if you move your face to a frown or a smile, your face doesn't move very much, but little muscle twitches can be recorded. Or sniffs are something we use a lot. So we can measure the breathing signals. So people are breathing. And then if they go, we can see, oh, a triple sniff just happened and record that. So we have the opportunity to have people tell us about their experiences during their dreams. We can assign them tasks. We can give them instructions during sleep. And so that opens the door to a lot more detailed studies of sleep than we used to have. So we can ask this question, which is yet to be addressed completely. What do dreams have to do with memory storage, if anything? What do they have to do with problem solving? I gave you one example of that. Another one that we have in press is what happens if you close your dream eyes? So we know when you're awake, if you close your eyes, you get lots of alpha. Is the same true during dreams? Well, we asked that question in one of Karen Konkoly's experiments. When you close your dream eyes, we asked people to signal to let us know when they close their eyes, and then to signal, did they still see a visual world out there where there are no visual percepts? And when you're awake, you close your eyes and no visual percepts. But when you're asleep, sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. So we get different answers to kind of allow us to link up the increased alpha, not just with closing your eyes, but with closing your eyes and not saying anything anymore. And one of the reasons we're looking at this is to, we have these basic questions about dreaming and what's it about, but we also want to ask, can we benefit people more by making use of your dreams? So if you're lucid, you can make use of your dreams in various ways. And I'm just going to allude to one such way. It's a contemplative practice. So there's actually history going back hundreds of years in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of using your dreams to gain insight. And we've been studying experts in that practice to see, well, what is that meditation like? So it's not like a focused attention meditation at all. It's more about exploring your dreams and experimenting with, well, what is it like to be a person in a dream? And could I actually be a different person in a dream? Or, what's the flexibility that you have in your dream state? And how can you kind of engage in these activities that gives you some insight? So it's called dream yoga. It's kind of mental exercises that you do during a dream. And we're experimenting with how is that working? Does it happen in REM sleep? The answer is yes. These things are happening in REM sleep. They can wake up to tell us about it and also have signals during the dream about what they're doing during that time. And we're exploring, can that actually, if you're not an expert in this practice, can you still use your lucid dream for some beneficial effects? So that's an ongoing question, and we're doing that. Gabriella and Daniel are focusing on those studies in my lab, and also collaborating with Buddhist monks who have been trained on the Buddhist literature on these practices and on Buddhist philosophy, but now have also learned cognitive neuroscience methods through a program run out of Emory University, the Emory Tibet Science Initiative. And so here's a picture of some of the monks in my lab learning how to do sleep studies with Karen. And now they also are engaging in those studies back in their monasteries to study this phenomenon, as well as other questions that they have where they can apply cognitive neuroscience. So that's really exciting, sort of adjacent project that's happening where we're looking at trying to understand the potential benefits of sleep, which it turns out their tradition has a long history of looking at. So I think I've gotten to the end of my time, so I'm gonna wind up here and see what questions you might have, but I'll just thank my collaborators and students and funding agencies, and thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Ken. Let's all unmute to give Ken a round of applause. That was such a great talk. Thanks so much. If you wanna, you can stop sharing your slides.